Previously on Why Do People Laugh at Spirit Science? Jordan informed us that human history is not at all like what we have been taught. Atlantis was real. Egyptians were omnipotent giants. Ankh is a sex act. And of course, Jews are from space. Hi everyone. Once again, Jordan has decided to take on the subject of history, and this time he's decided to throw in even more bad physics than last time. So, take all the usual precautions, put on your oven mitts, pad your desks, remove all sharp objects, and keep your popcorn within arm's reach. Here we go.
A theory is a good theory if it satisfies two requirements. It must accurately describe a large class of observations on the basis of a model that contains only a few arbitrary elements, and it must make definite predictions about the results of future observations.
Thank you. I have a feeling I'll be using that against you later.
A historical theory, on the other hand, is defined as a concept with several uses. Often, researchers will provide a theory about historical events and connections, an orderly preconceived impression of the phenomenon to be studied. Used in this way, theory means the same as hypothesis. So what you are about to witness is just that, a historical theory, a hypothesis about the way in which human history may have unfolded.
And anyone who reads the rest of the text in this very screenshot will see why what you just said is no better than anything else that comes out of your stupidity dispenser. Unfortunately, the page Jordan links to is now down, but from what I can tell from the screenshot, it's perfectly consistent with what Wikipedia says a historical theory is. A theory about why things happened the way they did, a perspective through which historical events are viewed. For example, you may have heard atheists talk about how most, if not all, conflicts in history can be blamed on religion. You may also have heard feminists say that they can all be blamed on powerful men having dick measuring contests. Both are obviously oversimplifications, but they don't contradict each other. They complement each other, contributing to a greater whole. But what every theory has to do is account for the known facts. Theories are not about what happened. The facts are what the facts are. The theories are about why things happened. What you're about to present is not a theory, it's something completely different that ignores the known facts and the historical method. So what's the historical method? Well, to answer that, first we need to consider what the study of history, the academic discipline of history that is, actually is. Yes, it's the study of the past, but not just any study of any past. For example, neither cosmogony nor paleontology is studied by historians. Historians deal with the past of human society and study it primarily by looking at the written records of events left behind by those who witnessed them. Because of this, the first problem one runs into when studying history is that people can write things that aren't true. For a good example of this, see the Spirit Science website. As such, no record can be regarded as completely trustworthy. So how do historians determine how trustworthy a record is? By applying something I'm sure you've never heard of, Jordan. Source criticism. Who was the author? How did the author obtain the information? Was he an eyewitness? Did he get the information from an eyewitness? Or was he just writing down hearsay? Why was the account written? Was there an agenda other than to simply record the facts for posterity? That is, was the author biased? How long after the event described was the account written down? Memories change over time, and stories change as they are retold. Are there independent accounts that corroborate this one? Is there any archaeological evidence that corroborates the account? Is the event described physically possible? And finally, one that's often left out, is the account really meant to be taken as a literal description of an actual event? That is, could it be intended as metaphor, allegory, or perhaps even fiction told purely for entertainment purposes? Now, I understand that you probably think this is completely unreasonable, Jordan. I mean, if I'm not mistaken, you think that all accounts are equally true, even if they contradict each other, right? Or perhaps you think that truth is whatever feels right for me, or something like that. Well, then you're clearly not interested in history, so why bother?
The year is 1847. A young archaeologist named Austin Henry Layard was Indiana Jonesing his way around ancient Mesopotamian ruins. He found 22,000 clay tablets hidden in the depths of the city. These tablets contained cuneiform, which today is one of, if not the earliest known writing systems known to man, created by the Sumerians 6,000 years ago.
So around 4000 BCE. The source you're citing says 3500 to 3000 BCE. Did you even read your own source?
Since the time of that discovery, we have believed that the first true civilization in all of humanity arose in Mesopotamian Sumer, located in present-day Iraq, around 6,000 years ago. Now, Sumer translates to land of the civilized kings, and their culture exploded onto the scene virtually overnight, becoming the cradle of human civilization.
No, Jordan, the Sumerian culture did not explode onto the scene virtually overnight 6,000 years ago. The oldest known large settlement in the region, Eridu, dates back to well over 7,000 years ago, so it had been around for over 1,000 years by then. And what we think of as the history of classical Sumer really begins with the dynastic period, about 5,000 years ago. Point being, no, the Sumerian culture evolved gradually over several thousand years. What I think you're referring to is that 4100 BCE is the date archaeologists use to mark the shift between the Ubaid and Uruk periods, but this is completely arbitrary. The real distinction between findings from these respective periods is the style of pottery, Uruk pottery being made using faster spinning potter's wheels that enabled mass production. That means that by then, humans had figured out how to make pots almost as fast as you make stupid. Almost. Yeah, okay, that's a very generous almost. Okay, it's not even close, but it's better than before.
Looking into the artifacts of Sumer is quite interesting, as they host a long list of archaeological firsts for the human race. Among these finds are the first schools, the first historians, They also developed the first astronomical and astrological systems,
which you are now going to spend a while misrepresenting if you get your information about them from Sitchin. For those of you who don't know who Zechariah Sitchin was, he was the guy who made up the planet Nibiru. You know, the one that got mixed up with the Mayan doomsday prophecy thing back in 2012. Yeah, I told you it was gonna get stupid.
These tablets that we are referencing were generally written between 2700 and 1600 BCE, and it appears many were translated down or cultural retellings from older stories. Among all of the tablets of Sumer that have been dug up, there are a wide number of variations and tellings of these ancient stories, which describe the mythological deities who created the world and the people who live upon it.
So right off the bat, you acknowledge that these accounts are hearsay at best, written down long after the events described supposedly took place, that contain supernatural elements and conflict with each other. Yet Sitchin treated them as reliable historical accounts.
Sometimes these changes expand upon or continue older stories, but often different scribes in various eras simply rewrote the tales to suit their purposes.
Oh yeah, they're biased as well. Epic fail.
The least accepted theory in modern academia is that these gods represented actual physical beings called the Anunnaki.
It's not just the least accepted in academia, it's not accepted at all or even considered. Sitchin was not an academic. He was a pseudo-historian, a complete crank who published everything outside of the academic peer-reviewed literature. He published his findings, his made-up nonsense that is, in popular books, bypassing peer review. That's not what you do if you want to be taken seriously.
Supposedly from the planet Nibiru. In order to identify if there's any substantiated evidence to these claims, we're going to begin by looking at the Sumerian creation epic.
Okay, a bunch of fictional characters with superpowers did magical stuff and were turned into assholes by the Babylonians. Move on.
Ultimately, the question remains, what does it all mean? To most in the academic world, this story is an allegory.
No, to all in the academic world, with reservation for the occasional crackpot that no one takes seriously anyway.
In the last 50 years or so, a different idea about what the story meant came to light. The story was a bit of a secret code, a story with clues alluding to something that really happened in history. This story has planetary collisions, alien spacemen, and so much more. And this story only came about because a young boy became obsessed with a burning question.
Guess who?
In the early 1920s, a young boy named Zecharia Sitchin.
Ding, 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 ding.
Why do you say giants? The older Hebrew says Nephilim. Who are the Nephilim?
Mythical giants supposedly wiped out in Noah's flood. My guess would be that it's a Bronze Age attempt to explain dinosaur bones. Huge bones must be the remains of giants. There are no giants. Guess they died in that flood we're making up anyway. Better throw in some line about them somewhere.
Zecharia realized that he had full faith in the Bible all along. What he was questioning was the translation of the Bible. Growing up, he searched for answers and soon learned about the discovery of the Sumerian tablets. He realized in order to understand the answer to this question of the Nephilim, he would have to learn Sumerian cuneiform.
So he went to college and got a degree in economy. You know, instead of studying ancient languages and history.
To him, he was overcome with an interpretation of the tablets that he believed was attempting to explain a series of actual physical events that took place in our history.
One that he pulled straight out of his ass.
As always, please have your own experience as we go through this story. Even if you don't believe this to be historical fact, you may enjoy it for the fascinating tale that it is.
The usual, I'm not actually saying that you're supposed to believe this excuse. And as usual, it's followed by...
Now, let us explore one of the most unique interpretations of this great celestial battle and truly see if it stands up to scientific scrutiny today. In Sitchin's theory of the Sumerian tablets, the story begins in the very early days of our solar system. The opening lines of the Enuma Elish begin, "When the heavens above did not exist, and earth beneath had not come into being, there was Apsu, the first in order, their begetter." Most commonly, Apsu is interpreted by scholars as the god of fresh water. Sitchin, on the other hand, believed this line to be describing the sun.
The sun god was Shamash. Sitchin changed the roles of deities to fit the story he wanted to tell. This is like saying that Thor wasn't the god of thunder, he was the god of sitting on your ass playing video games and drinking beer.
Tiamat was a particularly special planet, for it was entirely covered with water.
I'll summarize. Tiamat was the goddess of seawater, and she was cut in half by the god Marduk, her corpse supposedly becoming the earth. Sitchin interpreted this to mean that Tiamat was a Neptune-sized, water-covered planet located between Mars and Jupiter that was destroyed following 2 encounters with Nibiru, another Neptune-sized planet on a highly eccentric retrograde orbit which he claimed was associated with Marduk. Supposedly, Nibiru has its perihelion near Earth's current orbit, and an orbital period of 3,600 years. On one passage, one of Nibiru's moons smashed into Tiamat. The debris became the asteroid belt, supposedly explaining why there's so much water there. On the next passage, a similar collision sliced what was left of Tiamat in half, and one of the halves that got thrown into a lower orbit became the Earth. This may sound plausible, provided that you know nothing of physics or the stories Sitchin claims he got it from. Unfortunately for Sitchin, Marduk was associated with Jupiter, and the term Nibiru does not refer to a specific planet. The compendium known as Mol Apin identifies Nibiru as Jupiter, Marduk's star, but other ancient texts contradict this. For example, 2 tablets explicitly refer to Mercury as Nibiru. Never once is the term used to refer to a planet other than those visible to the naked eye. It appears that Nibiru is whatever planet happens to hold a certain position in the sky. One suggestion is that it refers to whatever planet marks a celestial equinox. i.e. where the celestial equator meets the ecliptic, the path the sun takes across the sky. This makes some sense given that the term literally translates to crossing. And then there's the physics bit. Let's start with the orbit. Nibiru's orbit is simply impossible. A 3,600-year period means a semi-major axis of a whopping 235 AU. Given that its perihelion is supposed to be at Earth, that's 1 AU from the Sun, that makes the orbit a tad bit extremely eccentric. The more eccentric an orbit is, the less it takes to destabilize it. Hi Jupiter! As we see in the simple simulation, which is to scale, mind you, including just the Sun, Jupiter, and Nibiru, every orbit has a different period. The height of the aphelion keeps changing. The orbit is very unstable. And oh look, there it goes, ejected after just about 70,000 years. And that's nothing. Still, in reality, it would probably be even quicker because there would be more objects interfering with it. Next is the problem that Tiamat was supposed to be the size of Neptune. Neptune has 58 times Earth's volume, so if Tiamat had the same density as Earth, it must have had 58 times its mass, minus 1 Earth mass to account for the asteroid belt. Today it has far less mass than that, but that's the estimated original mass. Most of that has since been ejected. Now, a planet won't be sliced in half from an impact as depicted here, but what would be possible in principle is for an impact to blow away half of it, with the debris being ejected or falling into the sun. This still wouldn't work in this case though, mainly because the Earth doesn't have a mass of 28.5 times that of Earth. The impact would also have to take place at a completely unrealistic velocity. What is realistic, albeit improbable, is that such an impact could blow away fragments, some of which could coalesce into a body the size of Earth. So if we don't take the story too literally, yes, I could give that a pass. Unfortunately, it still leaves two major problems. How did Earth's orbit get circularized? You'd expect the aphelion to remain at the site of the impact. Relative to the Sun, that is. And where's the rest of that Neptune-sized planet that's supposed to be right smack in the asteroid belt, clearly visible to the naked eye? Finally, there was never a Neptune-sized planet where the asteroid belt is today. The presence of Jupiter prevented a planet from forming there in the first place. That's why we have the asteroid belt, countless tiny rocks instead of a single big one. This is supported by the differences in composition between asteroids. They formed separately. For the same reason, we can also rule out the asteroids and the Earth ever being part of the same larger planetary body. So, no, Jordan, this doesn't hold up to the slightest bit of scientific scrutiny. Sitchin not only misrepresented the texts he claims he got this from, what he described is simply not physically possible.
Lamu and Lahamu are believed to describe Mars and Venus.
Once again, it looks like Sitchin was unfamiliar with the stories he claimed he got this all from. Venus was associated with Ishtar and Mars with Nergal. Now, I can't read cuneiform and I know very little about ancient Mesopotamia, but after the quickest glance at the academic literature regarding this subject, I can only conclude that the same was true of Sitchin. He was making shit up for an audience that knew nothing about the subject, and he made up a story that was so cool that they would want to believe it and buy his crap. He was a con artist, just like any other woo peddler out there.
Now, the search for a larger planet beyond Neptune has been going on since the discovery of Neptune in 1846, when observed anomalies in the orbit of Uranus suggested another large planet lay farther out. In 1992, refined calculations showed that the mass of Neptune was 0.5% smaller than assumed, and thus the discrepancies in Uranus's orbit were dismissed as incorrect, and the need for a Planet X went away.
I bet you think this is the part where I'm gonna say, hey, it looks like he's not as dumb after all, and then the next clip will make me facepalm. Yeah, well, you're wrong, I'm not falling for it.
Later, in 2003, Sedna was discovered, a small exoplanet whose strange 12,000-year orbit indicated that something massive, well beyond Pluto, was altering Sedna's path.
Hey, after 6 years of listening to Jordan's bullshit, my expectations are finally low enough to avoid at least some facepalms. To qualify as an exoplanet, a body has to A, be a planet, and B, orbit a star other than the Sun. Since Sedna is not a planet and does orbit the Sun, it is the exact opposite of an exoplanet.
In January of 2016, two well-respected planetary scientists, Konstantin Batygin and Mike Brown of the California Institute of Technology, discovered what they believed to be a large, roughly Neptune-sized planet in the outer reaches of our solar system.
Nope, they didn't find it, they predicted it. Planet 9 is, in my opinion, a very good hypothesis that definitely deserves to be tested. But as of the recording of this video, it has not yet been confirmed. But even if it is found, Jordan, you shouldn't get too excited. It's not Nibiru. The predicted orbit of this hypothetical planet doesn't take it anywhere near the inner solar system. It stays way, way beyond Neptune at all times.
With the exception that researchers don't currently calculate this planet traveling anywhere near Jupiter or the asteroid belt, the rest of the evidence appears to match what we've heard about Nibiru's path and influence.
No, it has nowhere near the same influence. It also has the wrong period, the wrong semi-major axis, the wrong inclination, hell, it even orbits in the wrong direction, and it has the wrong mass. Basically, the only thing it has in common with Nibiru is that its aphelion is outside the orbit of Neptune.
To that end, however, we theorize that if this planet is actually Nibiru, and it's been orbiting our solar system for millions or billions of years, then it's possible that its orbit has rounded out over time, becoming less sharp and stabilizing into a more centered and wide-curved orbit.
Just how would the perihelion be raised by interactions practically at the perihelion? This is Orbital Mechanics 101, Jordan. Let me illustrate using Kerbal Space Program. For those unaware, KSP is a sandbox physics simulator in which you build rockets that follow realistic physics. Well, realistic enough to include things like Newton's laws, conservation of momentum and energy, and stuff like that. And it handles orbital mechanics in a pretty realistic way. It's definitely realistic enough for the purposes of this illustration. And yes, this is just an illustration. Here's a ship on a simple orbit. Look at what happens if I thrust forward, prograde. The orbit gets higher on the other side of the planet. I add orbital energy in the form of kinetic energy that becomes extra potential energy on the other side. It's like you're throwing a ball faster, and that means it goes higher. The ship then falls back to its original altitude as it returns to where the burn was performed. As it falls, potential energy is converted back to kinetic energy. When the ball falls back down, well, the further it falls, the faster it'll travel, assuming that we're doing this in a vacuum, which we are. If I thrust backwards instead, retrograde, the orbit gets lower, but again only on the other side of the planet. Of course, Nibiru wouldn't be accelerated by rocket engines. Oh shit, I just gave Jordan an idea. But by gravitational interactions. But the same principle would still apply. So I ask you, how would the perihelion be raised when the only things Nibiru can interact with are practically at the perihelion? And of course, this whole idea ignores Nibiru's retrograde orbit and the timeline presented in Sitchin's books. Nibiru supposedly still had the orbit he described the last time it passed Earth, which was, again according to the story, in 556 BCE, and he predicted its next return to the inner solar system around 2900 CE. Jordan, Planet 9 is not Nibiru. Nibiru does not exist.
In the spirit of scrutiny, it's time we took a hard look at the person responsible for these stories, Zecharia Sitchin himself.
You. Scrutiny. Okay, I'm gonna need popcorn for this one. Hang on. What?
To some, Sitchin was a brilliant scholar with revolutionary ideas about the ancient Sumerian and Babylonian gods.
Those people think spirit science is actually science.
To others, he was a pseudoscientist and pseudo-historian with delusional thinking.
Those people typically do not.
A number of academics have spotted inaccuracies in Sitchin's translations. Some of these inaccuracies are perhaps interpretive as well, as Sitchin tends towards literalism, both in how he perceives images and words.
That's because the academics don't just look at individual tablets. In order to be able to translate a language, you have to understand the culture that used it. Otherwise, you're gonna misunderstand expressions and metaphors.
Certain scholars also contend through literal interpretation that Sitchin ignores known historical and mythological contexts in favor of his own views.
Exactly.
For example, Sitchin is very famous for pointing to a seal called Cylinder Seal VA243, which depicts an image of a circle surrounded by 11 smaller circles. This, according to Sitchin, is an image of our solar system.
And that's trivially easy to debunk because Nibiru doesn't exist and Uranus, Neptune and Pluto were only discovered after the invention of the telescope, thousands of years after that tablet was made. Clearly, this is not meant to be the solar system. And let's not forget that he completely ignored which deity was associated with which planet. He got literally everything wrong. You wouldn't happen to be related, would you?
Now, Michael Heiser has presented a great deal of information on his numerous websites explaining his theories of the Sumerian tablets, how Sitchin is wrong, and what he believes the tablets actually say.
Except it's not just what Heiser thinks they say, it's what everyone who can actually read them thinks they say.
But of course, with every debunker, there's a debunker for that debunker. And a man named Eric Vandenberg published a document titled Heiser is Wrong in response, and explains that due to Michael being a fundamentalist Christian, his perspectives on the tablets usually attempts to place the stories inside a worldview that fits with his own Christian perspective.
I'll grant that the document does include some legitimate complaints, but never once does it bring up anything to defend Sitchin's translations. So reading it was a complete waste of time, and I suspect that, as usual, Jordan, you didn't actually read it. Here's a quote. I do acknowledge that Heiser has brought up some legitimate points concerning lax methodological standards on the part of the ancient astronaut theorists. For example, it is true that Sitchin did take liberties with the translations of the Sumerian texts that cannot always be justified. So this is your idea of scrutiny? Not reading? Can this get any dumber?
We always want to remind everyone to practice healthy skepticism and discernment when looking over the information.
Apparently it could. But this has got to be it. This is gonna hurt, isn't it?
Speaking of interpretations, it's important that we recognize the version we have been exploring of the Tiamat and Marduk battle as these planets is only one interpretation, and there are others out there just as compelling. I'd love to take a moment now to explore another version that is extremely interesting, which is found within the electric universe theory.
Onk you. Onk you, you mother-onking son of a space Jew. Well, that's not happening in this video. To be continued. See ya.